For our final keynote address, and thanks for staying the course, we're really lucky to have Patricia Devlin, all the way from Magherafelt in the middle of Northern Ireland. She's a crime and investigative journalist, and for the last 16 years, although she doesn't look old enough, she's made it her sometimes lonely business, her mission, to cover organised crime and paramilitarism and drug gangs sometimes in Northern Ireland. A line of work which, unsurprisingly, has resulted in serious threats to her life. In 2021, Devlin was shortlisted in the International RSF Press Freedom Awards for successfully challenging the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the PSNI, over its failure to properly investigate serious threats to her and her young child over her work. So Patricia's going to start us off. She's going to do a little bit of a PowerPoint talking about her work. I'll ask her one or two questions, and then as usual I'll throw it open to you, and we'll finish at 6. Patricia.
Thank you, James, and thank you to everybody who's come tonight to listen to me harper on. I do a lot of talking about this, but it is a very important issue, and like James has said, there is serious problems with press freedom in Northern Ireland, and that's coming mostly from the threat from paramilitaries and other criminal gangs. So I'll get started with my PowerPoint. In April 2022, Reporters Without Borders said ending violence against journalists in Northern Ireland will require addressing both historical impunity and active acts and threats of violence. Now that came after 2 years of constant threats to journalists in Northern Ireland from criminal gangs. I mean, I could actually fill this slideshow with the threats that myself and my colleagues have received, and weirdly, the worst year for that was the year of the pandemic, and a year after Lyra McKee was murdered in the streets of Derry by dissident Republican gunmen. And so, remembering Lyra, I bet you a lot of people in this room did not know that more journalists have been killed in peace times in Northern Ireland than during 30 years of conflict and war. Of course, there's Lyra, but there is also Martin O'Hagan, a journalist who worked at the newspaper that I worked for quite a few years, the Sunday World. Martin was murdered on September the 28th, 2001 by the Loyalist Volunteer Force. In those 20 years, not one person has been convicted over his murder. 20 years later, Lyra McKee was murdered on April the 19th, 2019 by the new IRA as she observed a riot. Lyra, and this is going to be such a strange but beautiful story, I never knew Lyra until the day she was murdered. I had never spoken to her, and at that time I had been reporting a lot of drug gangs in Northern Ireland, and I'd been given a lot of threats, social media abuse, pile-ons. And on April the 19th, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, I received a Twitter message, and it was from Lyra McKee. And I'm sure you've read so much about Lyra, and you will know what kind of person she was. She was loved by everybody. She was a kind-hearted soul, and she was a passionate journalist. But her, I think one of the biggest things about her was her heart, and she had a huge heart. And that morning I received a Twitter DM from her just offering her support and how much that she looked up to me, which was, I mean, I was just absolutely honoured, and that if I ever needed a friend, that she would always be there. And she wrote quite a few other things that to this day I still look back and I read. And I remember the last message I'd received from her was around 6:30 p.m. that night. And I had went to bed quite early, and I woke up the next morning, and the first thing that I saw on Twitter was the BBC News article that journalist Lyra McKee was shot dead. And I couldn't believe it. And that conversation that we had on that day, on the day that she was murdered, which was about journalist safety, journalists supporting each other, I don't know why Lyra was murdered, why her life was cut short, but to receive that message from her on that day will always stay with me, and it will always be a very, very, very special thing for me to look back on. And so it's so hard that after losing such a young talent, an aspiring journalist who was going places without a doubt, that within a year of her being murdered, that we're seeing these types of threats to journalists in Northern Ireland. All these threats that you read here, all happened in the year after, or 2 years after Lyra was murdered. In fact, it's almost as if some of the people making those threats are nearly emboldened more to do them and send them out, because journalists have been murdered and because no one to date has been convicted over either Martin's murder or Lyra's murder. Now, I'm not really sure if you know much about Northern Ireland and the reason why there's paramilitaries there in the first place. We had a 30-year conflict between Republican paramilitaries, the security services and loyalist paramilitaries. Over 3,000 people lost their lives. So it's been 25 years since that conflict ended. We're still very much in a post-conflict society. And sadly, in post-conflict societies, nothing can be changed with the signing of an agreement by the words of a politician, by a magic wand. We're still living with the symptoms of that conflict, and one of those is paramilitaries. And so, even though they are no longer fighting or fighting for any cause, they still exist in communities, and those communities you will find are some of the most deprived communities where there's high unemployment levels. They're communities who are vulnerable, where paramilitaries can easily exert their influence. So a quarter of a century after the end of the Troubles, Republican loyalist paramilitary groups still to this day recruit, they still march, they still intimidate, and they still kill. Since 1990 to the present day, there has been over 6,000 so-called punishment attacks, and those are where paramilitaries have their own sort of punishment squads, or that's what they call them. In reality, it's just about exerting control in their communities. When I say a punishment attack, that can include people from their own communities, not their perceived enemies, being taken down an alleyway by appointment, with sometimes even young people's parents being involved in taking their children to these punishment meetings, and being shot in both legs. The reasons for that? Well, paramilitaries will say whatever they can to justify maiming and killing people. That might be that they have refused to do something that a paramilitary has told them, that they've been involved in antisocial behaviour, and there's even been instances of people being shot because they won't deal drugs for paramilitaries. And it's frightening that this still goes on, but it does. In 2021, the Independent Reporting Commission said paramilitaries remain a clear and present danger in Northern Ireland. Concentrated levels of quasi-control of paramilitary influence are in working class areas. Just like I said before, those areas are more vulnerable, where young people, in particular men, are more likely to be targeted by paramilitaries, be recruited to carry out drug runs, be recruited to hide guns, weapons, and carry out criminality, even causing riots in the streets, which we saw just a couple of years ago in response to Brexit negotiations. A surge in the drug trade since the end of the Troubles has put control in the hands of paramilitaries. So during the Troubles, there wasn't much drugs in Northern Ireland for a variety of reasons. But now since the Troubles has ended, that's surged. And so we are now seeing more paramilitaries making their money through drug dealing. And we have seen the effects of that in communities where there's higher drug use, where there's a lot more intimidation, a lot more assaults, and a lot more fear. They've also taken to loan sharking. A recent BBC Northern Ireland investigation found that some paramilitaries were actually taking social welfare books off people and taking their social benefits off them because these people have went to them for a loan, and they continue to hike up their interest rates, and some have even been hit with £5,000 fines because they've been late in one payment. And as you can imagine, if those people could afford the £5,000 fines, they wouldn't be asking for money. So when they don't pay that, they're even more in the grip and control of paramilitaries, and they're made to do things, mostly illegal things, for them to pay off their debts. In 2022, a security assessment revealed that there are 12,500 members of loyalist paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland. Those numbers are higher than those during the Troubles. Why? I don't know, but it's frightening. In March, the terrorism threat level in Northern Ireland was raised by MI5 from substantial to severe, and this was mostly coming from a threat posed by dissident Republican terrorists following the shooting of DCI John Caldwell, a high-profile detective in Northern Ireland just a few months ago. He has survived that attack, but the intent was clear. They wanted to murder him. So let me go into a bit about my work as a journalist in the Sunday World and the type of investigations that I was doing, and why then I became a target, and why also my colleagues have not only become targets, some of them have lost their lives. Investigations are surrounding paramilitaries. When you work for a newspaper like the Sunday World, that's what you're doing week in, week out. There is never a day that passes that there isn't a story about paramilitaries, that someone has rang into the office, that you're hearing about on the news, that in a police note that has been sent out, a press briefing note that there's been an attack. And these are the victims. This lady here that you see on the screen, this woman, a mother of 6 who had lived in her house in a mainly loyalist estate for 11 years. East Belfast UVF smashed up her house, poured paint all over the inside of her house, over her sofas. They smashed up her washing machine. They smashed up every utensil in her house. And the reason they did that was because her husband had a fallout with a senior paramilitary in the area. That's the type of people, that's the victims of paramilitaries. Working class people living in these areas. And then when we highlight it, or what they're going through, then we become targets ourselves. This particular family suffered so much at the hands of loyalist paramilitaries that they were eventually forced to leave their home. They're now living in an area where they feel safe. Again, here we go. Another woman terrified out of her own home. Graffiti sprayed on the walls, that's another tactic they use. They'll spray that victims of their control, their coercion, are drug dealers. They will spray paint on walls that they're prostitutes. They will spray that they're criminals, the very things that they are, to intimidate them out of their homes. And if that doesn't work, they attack their homes, as you've seen, and as we see here. Now, this lady who was attacked was only 21 years old. She had only moved into this flat, and within a week, she was targeted. That girl is now living with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and had to be put in a safe house for a period of a few months. What threat does a 21-year-old young woman who has nothing to do with criminality, paramilitaries, what threat does she pose to any member of her community? Again, more examples. This family here, again, Nicola, who we've seen in the first slide, whose house was wrecked by masked men. She refused to move from that area at first. She stayed for months. She refused to be moved out by the bully boys. She had phoned the police, she had made statements. In fact, she even recognised one of the men through his mask who had come into her home. But sadly, when paramilitaries want you out of their community, they call it their community, they'll get you out. So another death threat that Nicola received was having raw meat placed on her doorstep, which is basically a death threat. That raw meat was picked up by her 14-year-old autistic daughter, wondering why there was a piece of roast beef, lying on the front doorstep. Again, another house, another woman who's been targeted by loyalist paramilitaries, her house smashed, things spread on walls. That's what you're dealing with day in, day out in Northern Ireland. This, for me, was a very, very important investigation, and it sadly was one of the last investigations that I did for the Sunday World, because I had to leave my job as a newspaper journalist due to the amount of threats that I received. And when I tell you about this story, you'll understand why some people weren't too happy about me doing this story. So we all know that paramilitaries make money off drugs, but we have no proof. At this time in 2021, we had British politicians meeting with loyalist paramilitaries or representatives of loyalist paramilitaries, because sadly, paramilitaries still have political influence in Northern Ireland. And at that time, they were given assurances that loyalist paramilitaries were transitioning. What they mean by transitioning is coming away from criminality, that there will be no more paramilitary violence, there'll be no drug dealing, there'll be no threats, nothing. And the government said, that's great, we will give you loads of money to help you to transition. So they get the pot of money, and as we all know, but we don't really have any proof, that money might as well have been through in the river. That money isn't being used for paramilitaries to transition. So at this time, I had been investigating a notorious loyalist paramilitary group called West Belfast UDA C Company, who in the past have been responsible for such atrocities as the Grey Steel Massacre in the 90s, where 3 gunmen walked into a packed bar in County Derry and shouted trick or treat on Halloween before opening fire and killing 13 Catholics inside. So they no longer kill or carry out sectarian atrocities, but they are involved in the drugs trade in Northern Ireland. And this man here was the UDA's coke kingpin. It is unheard of for any person to come forward, especially someone up to their necks in criminality like he was, to come and speak to a journalist and open the lid on this empire. There was a reason, of course. he was facing death himself. So his own paramilitary godfathers had turned on him. This man, through this interview, was able to destroy the lie that any loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, and in particular West Belfast, were transitioning despite receiving government funds to do so. He revealed how the paramilitary group was not only supplying Class A drugs within its own communities in Northern Ireland, but across Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It showed the grip of the gangsters' control of the drug trade, where this individual alone was making £500,000 a month for West Belfast UDA. David Jenkins also made clear that the real reasons why paramilitaries still exist is to exert control and make money from criminality while using a flag of convenience, and that flag would be the Union flag. So that was a powerful investigation that came after months and months of those types of stories that you've seen beforehand, because being a journalist in Northern Ireland, you are continually investigating this. You're continually speaking to victims. I mean, I was even so lucky to have Nicola, and I say lucky, that's not the right word, but I mean, people are so scared in communities in Northern Ireland that they won't speak out because, I mean, the result of that would be being attacked further, having their relatives attacked, having their home attacked, having their car attacked. So they're not going to speak out. Nicola did speak out, and it's people like Nicola and even this individual who he himself is a criminal, by doing that brings more of a light onto these paramilitaries and puts the pressure on authorities to do something about it, which it did do. That was one of the last investigations I did, because between having police visit my home on multiple occasions telling me they had received intelligence that I was going to be attacked in my car, that I was going to be entrapped by being called by a contact to go to a story, then be attacked, and then the worst one being that I was going to be shot dead within 48 hours. I'd kind of had enough of it, and sadly I decided it was time for a break. A big part of that was because my children were also threatened by these people. I think as a parent, or for anybody to even hear this, being told that your newborn son is going to be raped is something that really makes you think about what you do and why you do it, and is it worth it? It is worth it, by the way, but it has a big impact on you. And so I took a break from journalism. I decided to come away from writing about paramilitaries and give myself a break, because mental health is so important, and I do believe it needs to be taught as part of journalism courses here. And I started up a podcast, which was one of the best things I ever did. And you're going to call me crazy and go, what is she doing? Well, my focus on the podcast was about the Troubles. However, it was about the past, and current paramilitaries, they're not paramilitaries, they're just organised crime gangs who use flags. So whether that's Republicans using the Irish tricolour or Loyalists using the Union flag, they're just crime gangs. But back when there was a conflict and people were fighting and the prisons were full, and so full that after the Good Friday Agreement, everyone was released, I decided to speak to some of those people who carried out murder, who were paramilitaries. I also spoke to victims who had lost relatives and loved ones during the Troubles. One of those interviews, and if you do get a chance, please go on and listen, and there's so many different stories on there from people who to this day are still traumatised from what happened, but are able to tell their story to make sure what happened to them does not happen again, because Northern Ireland has a fragile peace, and as all post-conflict societies go, anything could happen. No one knows. But thankfully, the will of the people in Northern Ireland today is no one wants to go back to that. So with this podcast, and I've just used this as an example to balance out the loyalist paramilitary stuff, this individual, I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard of him, his name's Martin McGartland. And Martin McGartland was a young man who grew up in 1980s West Belfast in the heart of IRA territory. He was in the heart of it all. And back then, when you lived in a working class area like Ballymurphy and you were of the age that Martin was, you were expected more or less to, at the very least, support the IRA, if not join them. But Martin didn't like the IRA. Martin was no angel himself. He enjoyed thieving. He enjoyed carrying out some things that I would say weren't exactly legal. But he despised the IRA, and when the RUC, which at the time was the Royal Ulster Constabulary, they had a special unit called Special Branch, and that was used to monitor groups like the IRA and also infiltrate them. And Martin was approached by Special Branch and was asked to infiltrate the IRA, and he did, and he nearly lost his life. In a nutshell, he stopped the murders of at least 50 people by taking information from the IRA back to his handlers. And he was eventually caught out. The IRA caught on that whenever Martin McGartland was going to a job, that the job never worked out. And when I say a job, that would be to murder someone or carry out a robbery or steal a car to be used in a murder. And so he was found out, and Martin was abducted and taken to a flat where he was tied up, where he would be interrogated, tortured, and then murdered, because informers, that's what happened. He was an informer, and he had informed in the IRA. He had went against the movement, and he was facing most certain death. But Martin, being the type of person that he is, he saw an opportunity to escape, and out of a third floor window he jumped through it with his hands still tied behind his back, while the IRA men who were going to murder him were taking a break in the kitchen. And so Martin escaped and moved to England, where years later again the IRA tried to murder him. A fascinating story. There's a film on it, 50 Dead Men Walking. There's also a book. But Martin spoke to me for this podcast, and it shows you the power that even so-called defunct paramilitaries like the Provisional IRA still have to this day, the power that they have, because Martin can never come back to Northern Ireland in peace times. Not a chance. He will be murdered. Doesn't matter if the Provisional IRA are still on the streets or not, he will still be killed. And that shows you just on both sides the power that the paramilitaries have, and Martin knows that. That's why he doesn't show his face in public. So if you do have a spare few hours, please go on and listen to A Spy in Exile on No Edit on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's actually on YouTube as well. It gives you a fascinating story about the Troubles and also to the present day, and what people experience in Northern Ireland and the issues that are still there. I've rambled on enough, James, but just if anybody would like to follow me on Twitter, on Spotify, on YouTube, Instagram, etc., please feel free to, and thank you for listening.
That was fantastic and gripping, Patricia. I won't take up too much of your time before I hand you over to the audience, because we've got about 25 minutes. But maybe briefly, how did you get into this kind of work?
I actually wanted to get into PR when I was at school. I don't know why, but I did. And I couldn't get a work experience when I was at school. And so my careers teacher said to me, oh, we have an ex-student that works at the Belfast Telegraph. She's a health correspondent. Would you go there for a couple of days? I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. And then I went, and I only spent 2 days at the Belfast Telegraph, and this was back in the early 2000s when it was a newsroom, like it was a bustling newsroom. There was 3 editions out a day. Yeah. I just fell in love with it because I was just so stunned that oh my goodness, you get to do like a variety of stuff. Like you could be writing about a dance contest, then you could be writing about something that's just completely different, like a murder, and then you could be doing something about politics. So I fell in love with a variety, and that was it for me. I was being a journalist, and that's it. And so how did I get into crime? Well, I worked in areas where there was a bit more deprivation, where there was a lot more crime, and so I saw the effect it had on victims. I just couldn't understand why is there paramilitaries? Why is this still going on? And then I just got deeper and deeper into it, and then building contacts, it just kind of became something that I was just doing all the time, and that was it really.
Yeah. And in terms of was it the West Belfast or East Belfast EDA guy, that great story about that man? Can you say anything about, that must have taken a huge amount of time in terms of getting him to, I mean, by anyone's measure, that's a fantastic scoop. Can you say anything about how that happened, how long it took?
Oh, you're talking the guts of 2 years for that interview to happen. Like I said, even the guys at the Sunday World, the editors, said, this is unheard of. These people don't speak to us. Like, we would be seen as scum in their eyes because we're highlighting what they're doing. We're shining a light on them. And that's why we get death threats, because we are shining a light. And so for that to happen, I'll admit he was pushed to probably speaking to us because he knew that it would be front page news, because his life was under threat. They had sent a man to shoot him, and actually they got the wrong guy. They shot some guy calling into his house. So he escaped death like that. So he knew his life was in danger. He knew he had to leave Northern Ireland, but he was just going to set the record straight and deliver that hypothetical bullet to them, because he was revealing that they were just a bunch of gangsters, criminals and liars, and they were getting government money. I mean, these people have community houses that they get money from the government to run. The very people who were sending him out to deal cocaine and poison their own communities, the government's funding their offices. It's crazy. So it took the guts of 2 years, James, and that's what I say. In Northern Ireland, especially at a newspaper like the Sunday World, you are just continually building on your contacts, even keeping, I mean, the best advice I can give to any investigative journalist is just make sure you focus on your contacts and build them and keep those relationships. You just don't know where they will lead to and what story or scoop that you're going to get next. And that is something that has greatly helped me, is having contacts from a variety of backgrounds. And when we're talking about paramilitaries, in paramilitaries and elsewhere, and that story, like I said, was unheard of. And now, that man has not came back to Northern Ireland. He never will. But I mean, I don't think we'll ever see that type of story again. Maybe we will. But yeah, it took time, James. It did take time.
Just one last question before I throw it open to the audience. So Martin O'Hagan, you know, no one has ever been charged with his murder. And, you know, it's all a bit shady because we sort of know who did it, don't we? Yeah. But there may have been potential informants involved too. Can you say anything about what you think? The reason why I say this is because there's all this energy now about you looking into the deaths of journalists, and forbidden stories are on the job. And I feel like every so often there's an attempt to get to the bottom of it, and it never succeeds. Can you say anything about that?
I can, and actually on my podcast I did an interview with Martin's brother, Fintan O'Hagan, and who is very clear that the men who murdered Martin O'Hagan were members of the Loyalist Volunteer Force, and most of them were police informants. So they were allowed to carry out drug dealing, killings, murder. Martin was exposing these people in the pages of the Sunday World every week. And like I've said, the word emboldening. These people were emboldened to murder Martin because they knew there would be no consequences. When Veronica Guerin was murdered in Dublin by organised criminals, the law was changed. What changed in Northern Ireland? To this day, the very men, and we all know their names, we know who killed Martin. We've published his name and picture on the front of the page of the Sunday World. I mean, it's shocking. And then for 20 years later, for Lyra McKee, the sweetest of souls, to be murdered as she observed a riot. And I know there's 2 men facing trial over a murder, but I'll hold my breath over that. And I'm sorry, that's how cynical I am of the justice system in Northern Ireland, how they've treated Martin, how they've treated his family, and there's no care. There's no care there whatsoever. Those people who murdered Martin are police informants, and till they die, they'll be protected, whereas Martin O'Hagan was never protected. Definitely, I haven't seen any figures for dissident Republicans. What we see with loyalist paramilitaries is they're a bit more widespread, whereas dissident Republicans, there would be like pockets of them in more hardline places in Northern Ireland. For example, Derry, that would be a stronghold for the new IRA. Derry and Strabane, very close together, whereas loyalist paramilitaries, we would see them in areas right across Northern Ireland, but mostly Belfast. In terms of numbers, again, for dissident Republicans, I don't know, but I can tell you that there is still some support for them in certain areas. In terms of loyalist paramilitaries and dissident Republicans, I don't think they're as deadly as what they were, but for example, when DCI John Caldwell was shot just a couple of months ago, no one saw that coming, so they still have the potential to be deadly. Loyalist paramilitaries, we've heard a lot over the last few years about them threatening violence. There has been disorder in the streets, but in terms of killing, I mean, throwbacks to the Troubles where there was sectarian murders, we're just seeing violence within their own communities. I think since the 1998 agreement was signed, loyalist paramilitaries have murdered more than 30 of their own members of their community, so it's strange, and I suppose again they're just crime gangs, and that's what crime gangs do. It all starts with online. So, I mean, I've had this talk with other journalists before. When it escalates online, you just have to, always be aware that that can become physical. And women in particular have to be very, very careful. My advice to you is, if you do ever get a pile-on or you're seeing a theme, I know a lot of women journalists get called witches and things like that online, and prostitutes and all that. Speak to somebody like James or somebody in the NUJ or anybody who is part of a journalism organisation, and flag it with them and seek support, seek advice, and most importantly, put your mental health first. Because if you're investigating extremists, that's tough enough. But when you start to be targeted by them, you have to make sure that you're well enough to carry that on. So yeah, anything online, that's the first red flag. Do you know what? I don't think young journalists need to do anything. I think the newsrooms need to do better. I think they need to look after mental health better. I think that this, and I can say this as being a journalist from Northern Ireland, this attitude where it's only a death threat or that needs to go, because it's not only a death threat, it's not only a pile-on social media, it's not only this can affect our mental health. So I think that newsrooms need to get better. They need to have better support for in particular young journalists, because what young journalist wants to come in to the industry when they're not getting that support, when they're seeing, and I did say that I had to take a break, I had to leave, and that was partly because I felt I wasn't getting the right support, not only from my employers but also the police as well, because I had to take a case against them, and the police ombudsman upheld that case because they failed to protect me and they failed to protect my son over social media threats. So I think a whole lot of stuff needs to change within the newsroom, first and foremost. And you asked me, do I regret anything that I've done? I've went over that question time and time again in my head, and yes, I could have not done the story and I wouldn't have got the threat. Yes, I could have not investigated that, and I would have had an easy life, but that's not why I did journalism. That's not why I went into journalism. So anything that I do, I don't regret, because I was doing it to help other people, and I just couldn't change anything. I just couldn't. And a lot of that is because of very poor decisions by politicians in Northern Ireland. They have so much to answer for. The divisive politics that we have, it's causing so many problems. So first and foremost, politicians will need to get a grip and stop setting up meetings between criminals and people who have been responsible for attacking and threatening journalists and democracy, from meeting people in Westminster. Why are they even going to them for? I mean, these people torture their own communities. Why? I mean, what's this about? What are they going to, start making policies for the Conservatives? It's just absolutely bizarre. And I also believe that as journalists, what we can do is all the time put more pressure, write about it, say, get more people speaking out about it, get more influential voices saying this is wrong, it's not right. But you'll find that because of the hostility towards journalists, and because of the death threats, and because of even what's happened to me with having my children threatened, you'll find journalists won't want to do that. And that is a chilling effect of what these people are having on press freedom, because journalists don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to put their head above a parapet. And so that has, absolutely damaged press freedom. Even for myself, I self-censor myself sometimes. There was times that I've written brilliant stories and I thought, I'm not posting it on Twitter because I just can't deal with abuse today, or I can't deal with a threat, or I can't, and that's impact. And it's so sad to see, like, a place in the UK, which RSF has said is one of the most dangerous places for journalists to work, just being left to float out there, and press freedom is being damaged in this way, and it will continue. Yeah, and absolutely, and I even feel now for younger journalists, there's so many different mediums with media, and you're trying, and you must be so busy. My just set time aside every week to check in with them, even if it's just talking, and just, it doesn't have to be about a story. It's about building that relationship with them, because that relationship will last for years, and just taking time to look after your contacts, because believe you me, that is what's got me through the last few years, and the great stories that I've been lucky enough to cover. They've helped so much. So just take time and just set that time aside. It's like setting time aside for yourself, your own mental health and your well-being. Also set time aside to check in and things with them, and don't let them kind of drift, because you want to keep that relationship going. You don't have to be best friends with them, obviously, but just keep checking in on them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Amnesty International has backed me from day one over my the threats to my son and to me, which was from a neo-Nazi group, by the way, which has loyal paramilitary links. And it was, and Amnesty was very focused on the human rights issue. I myself am taking a civil case against the PSNI over human rights issues to do with my son, because I don't want any other parent going to the PSNI to report such a horrendous threat and to not be treated with respect and with dignity, and just cast it aside. I don't want that happening again. So human rights is a huge part to play. And we have a great, actually, UK director who's from Northern Ireland, Patrick Corrigan. He's fantastic. So he's always trying his best to keep Northern Ireland in the news in terms of human rights abuses. So I've found over the years, paramilitaries are quite strange. Like, today, me talking about it, you kind of think, oh, they're bogey men who are can't be approached and stuff. Like, these guys are very normal people. They have very normal jobs. They love to hear themselves talk as well. So it's not that hard to get good contacts within paramilitaries. In terms of the higher up people who are making the big dough, like David had said, he was making his bosses 500k a month. I think it would be a little bit harder to speak to those people, but yeah, it's not as hard as what you think. And so you speak to them and then you get introduced to other people. There's also so many events that you can go to, that community events that you can go to, and you'll meet paramilitaries. You have to remember at one point, like, the Northern Ireland jails were that full with paramilitaries that they basically had to all let them out under the Good Friday Agreement. So you'd be hard touched not to find somebody who's paramilitary involvement. In terms of the current paramilitaries, what's happening now, there's a lot of breakaway factions, and a lot of these are the most dangerous because they're not technically, they're using the names of like the new IRA or the UVF, but they're just a drugs gang. Those people are a little bit more harder to get speaking to, but if you've got good contacts in the police or even the community, be that community workers who are hearing from victims and stuff, then that's a good way to find out what they're doing and what they're up to. So it's just that, it's just getting just a broad range, whether that be from someone who works in a community centre, obviously the police and paramilitaries, just having that broad range where not only to have good contacts, but also fact-checking stories and making sure that what you're being told is not lies, basically. All these people who have spoken to me come as a last resort. They feel they have nothing else to do, and I mean, it is dangerous. They know what could happen, and we have that conversation, but they already made their minds up before even contacting me, because it is such a last resort. It's like a public cry for help. Help me. They've went to the police. They've went to. I mean, we even have organisations in Northern Ireland called like Threat. What's Base 2? Basically, if you get a death threat, you can go to this organisation for it to be verified. They go to paramilitaries and verify it for you. Crazy stuff. But they have done everything they can, and that's their last resort. And so yeah, I take everything that I know there's a huge responsibility on me to make sure that these people don't get hurt out of anything that I've written. But most of the time they've already been attacked and intimidated, and just want it to stop.
Okay, I think we should leave it there. Thank you, Patricia Devlin, for such an
Thank you.
inspiring wake-up call.
Thank you for listening. Thank you so much.